Michael's discovery that Lucas is not his biological son begins with a single, seemingly innocuous moment, a DNA test taken as part of a family ancestry project. The results, however, reveal a shocking truth that turns his world upside down. Michael, a celebrated architect known for his precision and ability to create harmony in chaos, now faces the ultimate personal chaos. As he holds the paper with the results, disbelief courses through him. The statement, "Probability of paternity, 0%, is stark and unambiguous. His hands tremble as he rereads the results, trying to find a mistake, an error in the process. But there is no mistake. The thought, "Lucas isn't my son," loops in his mind like a haunting melody. He remembers the moment Lucas was born, his tiny fingers clutching Michael's thumb, the overwhelming rush of love that consumed him. Could all of that have been built on a lie? Michael doesn't want to believe it, but the evidence is irrefutable. That evening, Michael confronts his wife, Sarah. Her face, as he shows her the paper, transforms from confusion to a pale, guarded look. For a long moment, there's silence between them. Michael finally breaks it. "Is this true, Sarah? Lucas, not mine?" Sarah's eyes well up with tears, and she looks down, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not what you think," she begins, her voice shaking. Michael's voice rises, a rare loss of composure for a man usually so calm. "Then what is it? Because right now, it looks like my entire life is a lie." Sarah confesses, each word weighing her down. She admits to an affair that happened during a rough patch in their marriage, a time when Michael was deeply engrossed in a demanding project. She had felt neglected and vulnerable. The father of Lucas, she reveals, is a man from her past, Mark, a colleague she reconnected with briefly. Michael feels as if the ground beneath him has been ripped away. The pain of betrayal is sharp, but what stings more is the realization that Lucas, his son, might be taken from him in an emotional sense. "Does Lucas know?" Michael asks, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Sarah replies firmly. "He doesn't know, and he doesn't need to. You are his father in every way that matters." But it does matter. Michael starts noticing every small detail about Lucas, questioning if the boy's quirky sense of humor, his love for painting, his disdain for heights, things Michael assumed Lucas inherited from him, are really signs of someone else's influence. This doubt starts to eat away at him. Lucas, a bright and curious 10-year-old, senses the tension at home. "Dad, are you mad at me?" he asks one evening as Michael helps him with a school project. Michael looks at his son and feels a pang of guilt. "Of course not, buddy," he says, forcing a smile. But deep down, he wonders if he can continue pretending everything is normal. Sarah's family gets dragged into the drama. Her mother, a staunch believer in appearances, advises Michael to keep the secret buried for the sake of Lucas. "He's your son where it matters, Michael. Why ruin everything over biology?" she insists. But Michael isn't so sure. To complicate matters, Mark learns of the situation. Sarah reaches out to him in a panic, hoping to ensure his silence. But Mark, who has recently lost his wife to cancer and has no children of his own, is intrigued by the idea of having a biological son. He doesn't demand custody but asks to meet Lucas, claiming it's only fair for the boy to know his roots. This demand escalates tensions further. Sarah vehemently opposes the idea, while Michael is torn. On one hand, he wants to protect Lucas from unnecessary pain. On the other, he feels Mark's claim undermines his role as Lucas's father. The tension reaches a breaking point during a family gathering. Michael, unable to contain his frustration, lets the truth slip in an argument with Sarah. Lucas overhears, and the boy's confusion and hurt are palpable. "If you're not my dad, then who is?" he demands, tears streaming down his face. Michael kneels before Lucas, taking his small hands in his own. "I am your dad, Lucas. I've always been and I always will be." But the damage is done. Lucas begins to question his identity, asking Sarah pointed questions about Mark. Meanwhile, Michael starts therapy to process his emotions, unsure whether he can rebuild the trust that Sarah's actions have shattered. Lucas eventually meets Mark, despite Sarah's protests. The encounter is awkward but significant. Mark shows Lucas old photos of his younger self, pointing out the similarities they share. Lucas, overwhelmed, begins to grapple with the idea of having two fathers. Michael struggles with his own feelings of inadequacy. He fears being replaced in Lucas's heart, though Sarah reassures him repeatedly that Michael is the only father Lucas has ever known. The story doesn't reach a neat resolution. Instead, it becomes a journey of navigating a complex web of relationships, trust, and identity. For Michael, the question lingers: can love alone redefine fatherhood? Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. His small shoulders seemed heavier than they should for a 10-year-old boy, weighed down by confusion and a truth he was too young to grapple with. His room, usually a sanctuary of books, drawings, and small Lego projects, felt stiflingly silent. The sunlight streaming through the window played on his tousled hair, but there was no joy in it today. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding. I had spent the last hour pacing the house, trying to figure out what to say. Sarah's revelation had been like a storm tearing through our family, and Lucas had taken the brunt of it. I wasn't sure if I could fix this, but I knew I had to try. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. "Lucas," I began, my voice softer than usual, "can I sit with you?" He didn't look up, just gave a small shrug. I took that as permission and sat down beside him. The silence stretched, and I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on his desk. I wanted to say something profound, something that would sweep away the confusion and sadness, but words felt inadequate. After a while, Lucas broke the silence. "Mom said you're not my real dad," he whispered, his voice quivering. He didn't cry, but I could see the tears welling up, stubbornly held back. The words hit like a punch to the gut, but I kept my voice steady. "What else did Mom tell you?" "That I was someone else's kid first." "Box." His lip trembled and he swallowed hard, refusing to let the tears spill. "But you've always been here." "Always." I closed my eyes briefly, fighting back my own emotions. "Lucas, I need you to know something," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts. "It doesn't matter what a test says or what anyone else claims. You're my son. You've always been my son." Lucas finally looked up at me, his eyes a storm of emotions, confusion, fear, and a glimmer of hope. "But if you're not my real dad, then why did you stay? Why do you love me?" "Because I chose you, Lucas. The day you were born, when I held you in my arms for the first time, nothing else mattered. You were my son then and you're my son now. I don't care what anyone says." I paused, letting the words sink in. Being a dad isn't about biology. It's about being there, every day, for the big things and the little things. It's about loving you, even when things get hard. He blinked rapidly, his resolve crumbling. "So, you're still my dad?" "Always," I said firmly. "You'll always be my boy." Lucas threw himself into my arms, his small frame shaking as the tears finally came. I held him tightly, letting him cry, letting him pour out all the confusion and hurt he had been holding in. My own tears slipped out as well, but I didn't wipe them away. This moment wasn't about holding back. I was scared, he mumbled into my chest. I thought you'd leave me." I pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, my hands on his shoulders. "Lucas, listen to me. I will never leave you. Not ever. We're a team, you and me. Okay?" He nodded, sniffling, and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Okay." A soft knock on the door made us both turn. Sarah stood there, her expression hesitant. Her guilt was written all over her face. She stepped inside cautiously, kneeling down to Lucas's level. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry for how you found out. I should have told you differently, or maybe not at all until you were older. But I need you to know that no matter what, Michael is your dad. He's been the best dad you could ever have." Lucas looked at her, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the two parts of his world. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did you tell me now? Did you want me to leave Dad?" Sarah's face crumpled. "No, sweetheart. Never. I told you because I thought you deserved to know the truth. But I see now that the truth isn't just about facts. It's about love and the life we've built together. And your dad, Michael, is the most important part of that." Lucas seemed to consider this, then reached out and took both our hands in his small ones. "I don't care about Mark," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "He might be my dad in some way, but you're my dad, Dad. You've always been there for me, and that's what matters." I squeezed his hand tightly, feeling a mixture of relief and pride that I couldn't put into words. "Thank you, buddy," I said, my throat tight. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Sarah stayed a while longer, the three of us sitting together in a quiet moment of understanding. Eventually, Lucas started to relax, the weight on his small shoulders lifting bit by bit. He even managed to smile as we talked about his favorite books and the upcoming science fair. Later that night, after Lucas was asleep, Sarah and I stood in the living room, the unspoken tension between us still thick. She finally broke the silence. "Michael," she trailed off, searching for the right words. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I've shaken your trust. But seeing you with Lucas tonight reminded me of why I fell in love with you. You're a good man and an even better father." I looked at her, my emotions a tangled mess. "Sarah, I love Lucas more than anything in this world. That's not going to change. But trust, that's going to take time to rebuild." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I understand. I just hope we can find our way back to each other someday. For now, it wasn't about us. It was about Lucas." And as I watched him sleep that night, his face peaceful for the first time in days, I made a silent vow. No matter what happened between Sarah and me, Lucas would always come first. I would always be his dad. Lucas had always been an affectionate kid. From the time he was a toddler, he would run into my arms after school, his little face lighting up whenever he saw me. Even as he got older and developed his own interests, that bond remained strong. But tonight, as he stood in front of me in his pajamas, looking both fragile and determined, it felt like we were crossing a bridge that could never be uncrossed. "Dad," he started, his voice a mix of hesitation and resolve. He always called me Dad. It was never Michael, never anything less personal. That one word carried so much weight now, more than it ever had before. "Yes, buddy?" I asked, crouching down slightly to meet him at eye level. He was holding his favorite stuffed toy, a worn-out dog he'd named Toby years ago. Lucas didn't cling to it often anymore, but tonight it seemed to be a source of comfort. "I know what Mom said," he continued, his words carefully chosen. "But it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're my dad. You've always been my dad." Hearing him say it so plainly, so sincerely, broke something inside me. I couldn't stop the tears that welled up in my eyes, even though I tried to stay composed for his sake. "Lucas," I said, my voice trembling, "you don't know how much that means to me. You're my son. You'll always be my son." He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around my waist. His hug was tight, almost desperate, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he let go. I knelt down, pulling him closer, and he buried his face in my shoulder. I could feel his breath hitching, the way it does when he's holding back tears. "Are you mad at me?" he asked suddenly, his voice muffled against my shirt. "Mad at you?" I pulled back enough to look at him, confused. "Why would I be mad at you?" "Because of Mark," he said, his eyes glistening. "Because I'm not really yours." I cupped his face gently, making sure he could see the truth in my expression. "Lucas, you are mine. You've always been mine. You don't have to share my DNA to be my son. What we have, what we've always had, is bigger than that." He studied my face, searching for any hint of doubt. Finding none, he nodded, his lips curving into a small, tentative smile. "Okay." We sat down on his bed together, the quiet hum of the night settling around us. I put an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "You know," I began, trying to put into words what I was feeling, "being your dad is the best thing I've ever done. Watching you grow up, seeing how kind and smart and creative you are, that's what matters to me. Not a test. Not anything else." Lucas leaned his head against my chest, his small hand clutching Toby tightly. "I don't care about Mark," he said softly. "He's not the one who taught me how to build Lego towers or read bedtime stories to me. He's not the one who comes to my soccer games. You are." His words struck a chord deep within me. It wasn't just what he said, it was the conviction in his voice, the way he seemed so sure of our connection despite the chaos of the past few days. "I'll always be there for you, Lucas," I promised, my voice thick with emotion. "No matter what. That's never going to change." "I know," he said, his voice steady now. "And I'll always be here for you too, Dad." We stayed like that for a long time, just sitting together, the silence filled with an unspoken understanding. Lucas didn't need grand gestures or elaborate explanations, he just needed to know I was there. And I was. Always would be. As the days went on, Lucas seemed to find his footing again. He smiled more, laughed at my jokes, and threw himself into his hobbies with renewed enthusiasm. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me with a thoughtful expression, as if he was still processing everything. One evening, as we were working on one of his school projects, a miniature model of a medieval castle, he paused, holding a tiny plastic knight in his hand. "Dad," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yeah, buddy? Do you ever wish things were different?" His question was quiet, almost hesitant. I set down the piece I was working on and looked at him. "What do you mean? Like, if I really was your kid, by blood?" He fiddled with the knight, avoiding my gaze. I reached out and ruffled his hair, making him look up at me. "Lucas, you're as much my kid as anyone could ever be. I don't need anything else to prove that. And no, I wouldn't change a thing. You're perfect just the way you are." His face broke into a smile, and he nodded, seemingly reassured. "Thanks, Dad." The conversation reminded me of how resilient Lucas was. He didn't let the truth define him or our relationship. Instead, he clung to what mattered, the love and trust we had built over the years. One night, as I was tucking him into bed, he surprised me by wrapping his arms around my neck and pulling me into a tight hug. "I love you, Dad," he said, his voice full of warmth and certainty. "I love you too, Lucas," I replied, holding him close. More than anything. In that moment, I realized that nothing, not a test, not the circumstances of his birth, not even the mistakes of the past, could ever weaken the bond we shared. Lucas was my son, in every way that mattered. And I would spend the rest of my life making sure he knew that. It had been a few weeks since everything came to light, and I thought we were finally settling into a new normal. Lucas seemed to be his usual self, enthusiastic about school, his science projects, and his drawings. But lately, I'd catch him sitting quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. It wasn't like him to be so pensive. Something was weighing on him. I decided to bring it up one Saturday morning while we were out in the backyard. We had just finished a game of catch, and Lucas was sitting on the grass, his glove still on, staring at the ground. The warm sun filtered through the trees, but the light didn't seem to reach him. "Hey, buddy," I said, sitting down beside him. "You've been quiet the last few days. What's going on?" He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Nothing," he mumbled, which I immediately recognized as his go-to answer when something was bothering him. I gave him a nudge with my shoulder. "Come on, Lucas. You can tell me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." He hesitated for a long moment before finally looking up at me. His eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were shadowed by worry. I think this is all my fault." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his small hands fidgeting with the glove. "If I hadn't asked Mom about my real dad, none of this would have happened. You and Mom wouldn't be fighting. Everything was fine before I brought it up." My heart sank as I realized how much guilt he had been carrying. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Lucas, listen to me. This is not your fault. Not even a little bit." "But it is," he insisted, his voice rising with emotion. "I was the one who asked. I made Mom tell me. And now you're upset with her and everything feels broken." I shook my head, squeezing his shoulder gently. "Lucas, you didn't break anything. What's happening between your mom and me has nothing to do with you. It's about things that happened a long time ago, things that were never your responsibility to fix or even think about." "But if I hadn't—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice firm but kind. "You didn't do anything wrong by asking questions. You have every right to know about your family and where you come from. It's okay to be curious. That doesn't mean you caused any of this." He looked down again, his fingers gripping the edge of the glove tightly. It doesn't feel that way, he whispered. It feels like everything got worse because of me. I leaned closer, making sure he could see the seriousness in my eyes. Lucas, families go through tough times. Sometimes we argue, and sometimes we have to deal with hard truths. But that's not on you. That's on us, the grown-ups, to figure out. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked softly, "Are you and Mom going to get divorced?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. It was the first time he'd voiced that fear, and I realized how much he'd been holding in. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Lucas, your mom and I are working through things. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but what I do know is that both of us love you more than anything. That will never change." He nodded, but I could see he was still struggling to accept it. I pulled him into a hug, wrapping my arms tightly around him. "You're not the reason for any of this, Lucas. You're the best thing in my life. You've never been anything but a blessing to us." His small arms clung to me, and I could feel him shaking slightly. "Promise?" he asked, his voice muffled against my shirt. "I promise," I said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong, and you don't have to carry this on your shoulders. That's my job, okay?" He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine. "But you're not mad at me?" "Mad at you?" I gave a short laugh, shaking my head. "Lucas, I could never be mad at you for something like this. I'm proud of you for asking questions and wanting to understand. That's what smart, brave kids do." A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, though it didn't fully reach his eyes. "You're not just saying that?" "No," I said, ruffling his hair. "I mean every word." He seemed to relax a little, the weight on his shoulders lifting ever so slightly. We sat there for a while longer, just enjoying the quiet of the backyard. After a while, he leaned his head against my arm. "I'm glad you're my dad," he said softly. I felt my chest tighten with emotion, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "And I'm glad you're my son." That night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with a more peaceful expression than I'd seen in days. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy?" "I don't care about Mark," he said, his voice quiet but confident. "I don't need him. I've got you." I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "And I've got you, Lucas. Always." As I turned out the light and left his room, I felt a mix of relief and heartache. He was still just a kid, but he had been carrying the weight of our family's struggles on his small shoulders. I was determined to make sure he never felt that way again. Whatever happened between Sarah and me, I would protect Lucas from feeling like he was to blame. He deserved to grow up knowing that he was loved, cherished, and completely innocent in all of this. And I would make sure he knew that every single day. The nights were the hardest. After Lucas went to bed, the house seemed to grow quieter, almost oppressive in its silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock in the kitchen, everything felt louder, more pronounced. I'd sit in the living room, staring at nothing in particular, my mind replaying the events of the past few weeks like a broken film reel. Sarah and I had been trying. At least I thought we were. But every conversation felt strained, like walking across a tightrope with no safety net. Sometimes we'd talk about Lucas, and for a moment, it would feel like old times. We'd laugh about his latest antics at school or marvel at his creativity. But then the reality of everything that had happened would creep back in, and the air between us would grow thick again. I found myself wondering if we could ever go back to the way things were. Could I forgive her? Could I trust her again? These questions weighed on me constantly, and no matter how much I turned them over in my mind, I couldn't find clear answers. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch with a glass of water in hand, Lucas wandered into the room, rubbing his eyes. "Dad?" he asked, his voice heavy with sleep. "Hey, buddy," I said, setting the glass down. "What are you doing up? You should be in bed." "I had a bad dream," he said, climbing up beside me and curling against my side. His warmth was comforting, grounding me in the present. "Want to tell me about it?" I asked, wrapping an arm around him. He shook his head. "It's not important." We sat there for a while, the quiet wrapping around us like a blanket. Eventually, he looked up at me. "Dad, are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" "You look sad sometimes," he said simply, his young eyes full of concern. "Is it because of Mom?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. He was just a kid, he didn't need to carry the burden of adult problems. But I also didn't want to lie to him. It's a little complicated, Lucas, I said finally. Your mom and I are trying to figure some things out. But no matter what happens between us, it's not your fault. And it doesn't change how much we both love you. He seemed to mull this over, then asked, does that mean you might not stay together? The bluntness of the question hit me hard. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know, buddy, I admitted. We're doing our best, but sometimes grown-ups have to make hard decisions. Whatever happens, though, you'll always have both of us. We'll always be your mom and dad. Promise? He asked, his voice small. I promise, I said, pulling him closer. And you and I, we're a team, remember? That's not going to change. He nodded against my chest, seeming reassured. After a while, he drifted off to sleep, his breathing slow and steady. I carried him back to his room and tucked him in, standing by his bed for a long time after he was asleep. The love I felt for him was overwhelming, a force so strong it left no room for doubt. Whatever the future held, Lucas would always be my priority. The next day, Sarah and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. Lucas was at school, and the house was eerily quiet again. She was washing dishes, and I was leaning against the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. We hadn't said much to each other that morning, and the silence was starting to feel unbearable. Michael, she said finally, her voice tentative. Can we talk? I set the cup down and nodded. Of course. She turned to face me, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. I know things aren't great between us right now. And I know it's my fault. I want to know if there's any hope for us. I looked at her, searching for the right words. Sarah, I don't know, I said honestly. I want to believe we can get past this, but it's not something that happens overnight. Trust takes time to rebuild. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I understand. I miss us, Michael. I miss what we had. So do I admitted. But things are different now. We can't pretend this didn't happen. The tears spilled over, and she quickly wiped them away. I'll do whatever it takes, she said softly. I just hope you'll give me a chance. I'm not giving up, Sarah, I said, my voice steady. But I need time. We both do. And in the meantime, we have to focus on Lucas. He needs us to be there for him, no matter what. She nodded again, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. You're right. He comes first. As the weeks passed, we settled into a delicate balance. We worked together to keep things as normal as possible for Lucas, putting on a united front even when things felt shaky between us. Some days were easier than others. There were moments when we laughed together, when the weight of everything seemed to lift, if only for a little while. But there were also moments when the tension was palpable, when the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Through it all, Lucas was my anchor. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of what really mattered. He was the reason I kept trying, the reason I held on even when it felt impossible. One evening, as I was tucking Lucas into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. Dad, he asked. Yeah, buddy. Do you think everything will be okay? His voice was tentative, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. I sat down on the edge of his bed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. I think things might be different for a while, I said carefully. But different doesn't mean bad. And as long as we have each other, we'll be okay. He seemed to think about this, then smiled. As long as I have you, I know I'll be okay. The lump in my throat made it hard to speak, but I managed to say, and as long as I have you, I'll be okay too. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I allowed myself to hope. The future was uncertain, and there were no guarantees. But one thing was clear, my love for Lucas was unshakable, and that would never change. Whatever happened, we would face it together.